This is The Secret Library, a podcast about writing and publishing books. I'm Caroline Donahue, a life coach who works with writers, and I'm here to tell you this is your year. It's time to stop waiting and start writing. The Secret Library podcast is brought to you by listeners like you from the Secret Library podcast Patreon. You can check it out and support the show at patreon.com/secretlibrary. This is episode 119 of the Secret Library podcast. I'm very, very excited to be back after a little hiatus of releasing new episodes. My guest today is Simon Van Booy. He is the author of The Secret Lives of People in Love, Love Begins in Winter, which won the Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, Everything Beautiful Began After, The Illusion of Separateness, which was a national bestseller, and Tales of Accidental Genius. His latest book, out now, is The Sadness of Beautiful Things, a short story collection. He's the editor of 3 philosophy books, and his essays have appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, The Guardian, and Elle Men China, where he writes the monthly New Yorker column. He's written for The Stage, National Public Radio, and the BBC. He teaches part-time at the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan and frequently hosts creative writing courses. And in 2013, he founded Writers for Children, a project which helps young people build confidence in their literary abilities through annual writing awards. His fiction has been translated into 17 languages, and he lives in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, with his wife and daughter. I really, really, really love talking to Simon. I felt he had a lot of common references. I studied art history, so it was really lovely to dive into some other influences and how they have an impact on our writing. And I just really adored this short story collection so much. There's so much in it. There's a variety of experiences, of characters. There's even some genre bending, which I really enjoyed. So we talk about what makes a story exciting to write, this short story collection, which is really wonderful, as well as the process of writing as a whole. I've been waiting to release this because we recorded it about 6 weeks ago, I would say. Maybe even longer than that, actually, now that it's coming out. But I was absolutely delighted with this conversation, and know you will be too. So I'm very excited to introduce Simon Van Booy. Hi, Simon. Thank you so much for coming on.
Hi, Caroline. How are you?
I am good. I am so excited to talk about your book because the idea of gathering stories that have been heard over a period of time and then transforming them into short stories was so delightful to me. And at the same time, I thought, wow, why has no one done this? So I wanted to know how you got the idea at first, because you collected them over about 10 years. Am I right?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
So did you know when you heard the first one that you might be onto something, or was it sort of as you continued that you thought, oh, maybe I should put these all together?
Well, the half of the stories in the collection I'd heard, maybe about 10 years ago, and I didn't have the skill to put them into a short story. I mean, I was told some of the stories I was told, by crackling fire with a dog on my lap. I mean, it really was that sort of traditional, where I was in somebody's house in Ireland, and but I tried in the months following to craft it into something, but I didn't know how to handle time, or there was something wrong there was too much of a secondary character. So technically I just didn't have the skills, and I sort of kept them in the back of my mind, and I would tell people the stories orally, but I just couldn't get them down on paper in a way that really worked. So I think probably accidentally I read my way into understanding how to draft the format of certain stories. And then other stories, Not Dying is probably the hardest story I've ever written. And I had the idea for that probably 7 or 8 years ago, where I rented a house I have some relatives, children, who didn't really leave New York very much, the city. So I thought, well, I should rent a house in the middle of nowhere, like an old farmhouse, and drive them up there. This sounds creepy, doesn't it? Like it's like it's a murder film.
And never bring them home.
Yeah, hide them in the chimney.
Yeah,
Actually,
exactly.
that sounds horrific. But there's probably a murderer listening, saying, "Yeah, absolutely, that's like the perfect weekend." So I rented a house in upstate New York, and I drove them up. And I think they were 7 years old and 10 years old, and then my own daughter was about 6. So we drove up, and my brother, who's a scientist, had sent me this rocket, this 12-foot rocket that you build, and then you fire it by pumping 7 or 8 gallons of water into some kind of tank, and then you release it, and the rocket apparently goes hundreds and hundreds of feet into the air, and it's amazing. And
I think we had one of these when I was a kid. It was amazing.
Yeah, anyway, so I thought, well, great, this is a great opportunity for us to launch the rocket. And so I stopped at a Walmart or some other, shop that's also a village, and I bought orange hats and orange vests so that we would go out to the field and we'd all be visible. And apart from the wind blowing the rocket as I was pumping the water into the thing and it almost decapitating like one of the children, which of course, because as it was about to launch, the wind blew the rocket sideways. So it was like it was pointing at like poor Timmy, who was just, jumping up and down, waiting for his rocket to explode. And thankfully, though, I managed to straighten the rocket. But they all went to bed early that night, which is quite an achievement if you've ever had experience of children. And I think
it must have been the excitement of the rocket.
Yes, they were all fast asleep by 2 a.m. No, I'm just kidding. They were in bed by about 10 o'clock at night, and so I'm in this farmhouse with a roaring fire, and they're upstairs, and I'm bored because there's no internet, there's no cell reception, there's no TV, and that was when I didn't have a DVD player or anything. So I really had to do that strange thing where I sort of have to think and reflect on my life. And so I'm sitting there, in front of the fire, and I think, Jesus, imagine if I was able to get cell phone reception and I caught some kind of breaking news that the end of the world is coming. We've got 6 more hours to live, meaning, that there's some kind of cosmic event where the Earth is going to be sucked up into the sun, and it will all be dead in milliseconds. So then, if we are 3-4 hours drive from New York City, should I try driving into New York if we've got 6 hours to live? And they're upstairs asleep. And if I did, I'd probably get stuck in traffic. I mean, even the end of the world wouldn't affect New York City traffic. And
no, probably not.
And so, should I do that, or should I wake them up and tell them, "Oh, guys, I've got some rather interesting news. We're all going to die." I mean, not in decades as we had hoped, but actually quite soon, before breakfast. And or should I let them sleep, or should I kill them? Should I suffocate them with pillows before they sort of burn alive in panic and fear? So I thought this, I didn't tell them this the next day, but I thought
You'll never believe what I was thinking about last night, you all.
Yeah, but I thought it'd be quite good as a story. What would you do? So I stayed up for a few hours thinking, well, what would I do? And then of course I didn't know how to turn it into any kind of, whether it should be a film or whether it should be a play, whether it should be a short story. And 4 years later, I drove back up to the same house. I rented it with a friend of mine, and we went up there for the weekend. And I walked around in the snow, as the character does in the book. And I hiked up into the mountain about 2 a.m. With ropes and things like that. And I lit the fire, and I did everything the character does in the book. So my friend went to bed early, and I stayed up all night going through what the character does in the book, making notes, looking at the farmhouse in that context. And I still couldn't write it into anything. And then I was listening to fugues by Bach, which are really, really strange things. It's like the same melody, but played all these different times and then sort of layered over itself. I'm not sure I completely understand, but I think that's sort of the general gist of it. Mm-hmm. And so what I thought was I would That's it. That's what I'll do for the story. I will layer this story as a fugue. So we'll have it's the theme of, I suppose, loss, which we're all going to have to deal with, if we want to be happy, to confront it instead of sort of deny it, sweep it under the rug. And so it goes back, I suppose, to the Buddhist idea of attachment, where we suffer because we get attached, but the nature of life is change. So I laid it down as a fugue, listening to the Bach's fugues, and that's the format the story is in the book, not dying. And a friend of mine who was on the verge of dementia in her 80s, very depressed, she wanted to commit suicide. It was a very sad situation, but eventually she died a few months ago, and I don't know if any of your listeners have ever had the experience of when someone dies, you actually feel relief. And guilt, of course, for feeling relief. But
because my grandmother had dementia, and yes, I understand the tension exactly.
So I'm sorry to hear that about your grandmother, Caroline.
Thank you.
And I went to, but it doesn't, even when they get sick, it doesn't erase all the brilliant memories. Like, a few years or a few months of suffering doesn't, or forgetting doesn't erase all those wonderful moments you had with her.
Absolutely.
But anyway, well, so I went to see her, and I said, "So how's life? What are you doing?" And I said, "Tell me everything you're doing." And she said, "Well, I can sum it up in 2 words: I'm not dying." And so I thought, well, that's a good title for a story.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, and so that's how I got that title, and so that's sort of the true event of being in that house, and then layering it like a fugue, and then the thing about the man who, at the beginning in Kentucky, he told me a strange story. I think I should probably let you talk. I think probably I feel like someone's giving me an annoying look, like I'm going on too much. So I'm just going to stop there and see if you have any questions.
Well, I think, for one thing, absolutely not. No one is giving you an annoyed look. I can guarantee that. But I'm interested in where the line is between the point where someone told you the story and then you leapt off into your own process, and what kind of loyalty you felt, hearing these stories from people, and where it went into another direction. I mean, the one that I'm thinking of in particular is probably, unless I have missed out on some major scientific developments that have happened in the last few years, in Playing with Dolls, I'm assuming the direction the story went in is not currently possible, but that there was something about the story at the beginning that you heard. But correct me if I'm wrong, and this whole thing is happening, and I had no idea.
No, it's not happening.
For everyone listening, the story, there is a family that loses a daughter, and then there is a virtual replacement, which is inserted into the situation. I won't say more about the specifics, but it did have a bit. It was an interesting genre cross into a sort of a sci-fi element.
Yeah, there's which one reviewer said, "How can this be based on a true story if it's a sci-fi?" And I thought, like, critics are so literal.
I'm dying for it to be.
Yeah. Well, actually, I look. You look in your junk folder in your email, and it says like carne, like some. So like there's a Spanish one. I get a lot of Spanish junk email because I think I signed up for People magazine for my daughter who's obsessed with gossip, but I accidentally put People en Español. So now I get all this junk mail in Spanish, which
amazing.
Which is quite wonderful. And then I'll get Simon, are you happy with your breast size? And it's not something
I've thought about it.
Yeah, it's true. I haven't thought about it, but now I have. I'm not sure I am satisfied. And then I'll get something else saying like, meet Russian ladies now. And I'll think, and then I'll get, meet Singaporean ladies tomorrow. It's like, there's a lot of, and then it's like, Simon, I've got 700 million euro, but I need you to send me 20 euro in order for me to process it. And then I'll give you a reward. And those things are not true, by the way, don't click on them.
Oh, no.
And then I got one that said, are you happy with your love doll? And I thought, well, I don't have a love doll. I have a teddy bear jig that I'm celebrating 40 years of companionship with, and but I don't have a love doll. And then I actually did. Can I say this? It's just you and me, though, isn't it? So I clicked on it, and I realized that this love doll business is really quite a burgeoning sort of industry, where people who I suppose, I mean, I don't judge, because loneliness is one of the hardest things to cope with, and you can live around people and still be lonely. And so I suppose these dolls that are manufactured mostly in California, they sort of look real, and some of them blink, and now they're developing dolls that can actually move and things like that. And so this is in the future probably that people will have companions that are dolls, but they're sort of they won't argue with you. Well, maybe they will. Maybe
they'll make ways that argue. The arguing model,
and point out your faults. And so people who are masochists can get these dolls.
I wouldn't be surprised.
And can you imagine people like running down the street from their dolls?
She's really in a mood today.
Or people dumping their dolls, like in back alleys, and then driving away.
Oh yeah, they can live out all kinds of fantasies. What makes me think? Have you seen the film Lars and the Real Girl?
I loved that film.
I loved it so much.
Apparently there's like a soldier doll, like a US Marine doll, and that doll is popular with apparently like single and married women in mostly Republican states, according to the
of course
the love doll manufacturer. So I thought that imagine if we could get a replacement doll for people we love, and then you could download their personality into the doll. So the way your brain fires, that would be recorded and downloaded, so then the doll would know how to respond. It just wouldn't be able to learn any new information and assimilate it. Do you see? So the doll would be at the age the person we love died. And so this is about a couple who are trying to reconcile the death of their daughter while she's right there. But it's not her. But this is the thing, is the doll doesn't realize that she's a doll.
Of course not.
And that's the crux of the story is, where does human rights... I mean, if we go into space, who's there to enforce human rights violations? Because there's no law in space, apparently. So it's the same with artificial intelligence. Who can enforce human rights for non-human intelligence? And I think this is something our grandchildren and great-grandchildren are going to have to come to terms with. And there's going to be people who do not care about non-artificial life forms. But arguably, if they don't feel, if they do feel, does that... So it's a really gray area that I wanted to explore.
Amazing. Yeah, it was so fascinating reading that and thinking, nobody ever thinks about, young people who die. It's like, there's a thought of like partners or so on, that people worry about in these contexts, but to think about a child, which is the most, heartbreaking of all, because you don't expect that to happen. You don't expect a child to go first.
Yeah, that's probably the worst thing that can ever happen to a family. The hardest thing. Because we're not in control, and people are in control. If they mess up their lives with infidelity or gambling or alcoholism, to some extent, we all have the power to try and undo the things that have happened to us so that we don't repeat the same mistakes. But when a child dies, the hardest thing, I think, is dealing with the fact that if you'd left the house at a different time, or if the weather was different, it might not have happened. That the idea that, and then you think, well, God, our lives are just chance, aren't they? If it wasn't a certain temperature in the backseat of that Camaro, there'd be no Simon.
Right.
So it's like it takes us into this gray area where, oh my God, then if we go back in time by accident and we're like, Jesus, I'm like 5, 6, 7 years before my actual life that I was a few minutes ago. And then like, well, my child hasn't been born yet. So I should find the person I'm going to have the child with and then have sex with them to bring them back into the world. But I think according to scientists, if you have sex at a different time, or if you're in a different position, or if the body temperature is different, it could be a different child. So then where's my child?
Right.
So then what does that mean? It means that I suppose every child could be your child. Every person could be your mother or father. And then that takes me onto the idea that you can't love one person. If you want to love one person, you've got to love everybody. Otherwise, it's inauthentic from the point of view of logic.
Absolutely. That's fascinating.
It's hard to love people because, people are difficult, and people demand more love than they could possibly ever get, usually. It's hard. We're so neurotic, but we also have so many wonderful things about us.
I think that's something that I love throughout the whole collection of stories, is that people are, well, they're presented with these sort of heartbreaking or challenging or difficult situations, but most of them leave you feeling more hopeful about humanity in the end rather than less. I think they're all trying to do the right thing.
God, that's a really nice thing that you could say, because a lot of people have criticized me for many things, which are always usually true. But when it comes to my work, I've been criticized for having what are called, hopeful, optimistic endings, as opposed to, well, I think what's been fashionable is sort of people who were very powerful and handsome, suddenly becoming corrupt, and that's sort of aftermath of the 80s, when all the films showed us basically a world, an America, which we might be leaning toward. But leaning is different from heading toward, I think. And anyway, but my endings are usually hopeful because I start off in the shit. I start off in the mud. And then, because that's, I feel like, how we are. That's how we are. I mean, I don't know anybody who has an amazing life and there's nothing that's going wrong, and they don't really, if they are, it's in the mail, it's coming. But a lot of the people I know, they're anchored to some past event, which kind of controls how they see things now. Maybe they pound drinks because of something that happened to them as a child. So it's like Grendel and Grendel's mother from Beowulf. You can defeat Grendel, but what about Grendel's mum? You can stop drinking, but what was it that was making you do it in the first place? And so I prefer to, I suppose unconsciously, to start my stories off in the worst possible situation. And then, as I've tried to do myself, how do we get out of this pit? So my stories, in a way, I wanted to be kind of maps for people who were in these prisons, like I was and am sometimes, and there's no lock, there's no guard, but we're in these prisons and we don't know how to get out, because Lord knows we're not taught it in school. We're taught how to cook an egg, or how to, measure a rectangle.
Really? We didn't get taught how to cook an egg. You guys are way ahead of us.
Oh, home ec was my favorite class.
No, it's amazing. We didn't have it anymore. They were like, oh, we're past that.
Oh, that's terrible.
And I don't think we are.
Eggs are very difficult to cook well.
They are.
So really, that's it. So I'm different than a lot of my contemporaries who are excellent writers, of course, whereas I start off in terrible circumstances and work my way out, as opposed to starting off in fortuitous, good circumstances, and then going down into and then ending it with life is meaningless. Life is meaningless, and that's why it's meaningful, because it doesn't mean anything. We're a blip in the universe, yet here we are, Caroline, chatting, having fun, laughing. I'm drinking tea. I have a cookie on the horizon.
That's always a good place to be.
Yeah. And there's a dog outside, and so it's the everyday things. I feel like that. Why does life have to have meaning for us to be happy?
I think that there's something that I have heard, and I believe this, but I'm disappointed that I believe it, which is that, those moments where people have said that readers will believe coincidences if they lead towards something negative, but they have a harder time accepting coincidences in fiction if it leads to something positive.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think that might go back to what Joseph Campbell and talked about in his mythological texts, and of course George Eliot. I think in her novel Silas Marner, she says that people prefer to if they feel like, if they obsessively worry or have anxiety about something or they expect negative consequences, it's less likely to make it happen because they're expecting it. So it's a part of the human psyche where we almost, prepare ourselves for it, hoping, because if it's, I suppose it's like the Greek idea of where, if we, the idea of tragedy, where you fall from a height. So I suppose the British have perfected this, where they just imagine it's sort of like the art of pessimism, where the more you worry that something's going to go wrong, the less likely it is to actually happen to you. Whereas it's the people who like go about innocently, like characters in Bruegel's paintings, where over the horizon there's some terrible inferno waiting to engulf them.
Right.
But to me, I realize as looking at it scientifically, inspired by Stephen Hawking, it doesn't matter. I mean, because what I think, and this is where we get into difficult territory, because my daughter, when she was 5, said, "Dad, if I pray for things, does that make them more likely to happen?" And I said, "Well, that's the idea." And, this sort of silent wishing we do. Question. It's tough. And then she said, "But what if I pray for negative things? Is prayer like equal opportunity? Like, is prayer only valid if it's what we would consider to be morally sound? And if so, then how does the science work? How can prayer be tangible if it only works in one direction? Because then that would imply that." Do you see? So it's a very, very difficult. But then I pray. I don't know who I'm praying to or what, but it feels like I'm doing something, and I'm not ashamed to admit that. I don't have anyone or anything in mind, but it feels good and it feels sincere and authentic and it feels engaging. Prayer does. But as an atheist, I don't know who I'm doing it to.
It feels like voting.
Yeah, it's funny, isn't it? But
I'd like to put a point in favor of this outcome, please.
Karl Marx said in his, when he wasn't thinking about money, he was actually a very wealthy guy, which is shocking. The guy who came up with, Karl Marx, German ideology, Communist Manifesto, was actually ended his life in a really bourgeois situation. But anyway, he believed that there was this sort of web of consciousness. And of course, in the American writer Emerson said that there's an oversoul. And I certainly think that we're all connected. We have to be. One of the questions, I think, to get into Oxford University, often, a lot of good universities don't look at test scores. They want to meet you and they ask themselves, is this somebody I want to teach? And one of the questions, I think, for the math department is if how many grandparents do you have? 4. How many grandparents did your parents have? Well, they each had 4. So if you think about how many grandparents everyone had, and then you think about that for the population now, how many grandparents, biological grandparents, does every person living now have? And then you may do that sum, get that figure, and then you ask yourself, well, those people then, how many of those grandparents had grandparents? And then what happens is, as we do the math, it looks strange because there's less people in the past. I think 60 years ago there were 3.5 billion, not 7 billion like there is today. And then but if there's less people, then if everybody had more grandparents, the math tells us that there's more people in the past. So then it's a question not just of math but of logic. So I think the students, it took me a long time to get this. I wouldn't have got in, but the answer took me several months thinking about this. But the answer is, of course, that we're all related.
Yes. Or that we share. More than one person can have the same set of grandparents.
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you go farther and farther and farther back, when there's less and less and less and less people, we really are actually related. And so the idea of the Buddhist idea that we're here to overcome the illusion of our separateness, that's actually an idea that can be proven through math and logic, which I think is excellent. It's, 1-0 to math and logic.
Yes, exactly. I think that's something that is, that's something that I love about stories, is that you can take these concepts but make them something that you can actually get your mind around. Like, I'm thinking of the doorman a little bit as you're talking about that the last story in the collection, that there is this overlap between people and that people are playing different roles simultaneously. Somebody can be a doorman, but also a really important figure in music at the same time. But people don't see people as having this overlap in their identity when we're out going about our day-to-day lives. And I think that's something really fascinating to consider. And it was something that I think also went through the collection, was you see people in one light, but then you change how you see them. The same with the pigeon, about the boxer who decides to see an assailant in a different light than he presents himself at first.
Yeah, that really that's very close to a true story. The story, the boxer.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean,
I wondered about that one. This is about somebody who was mugged in New York and then handles it very differently than I think many of us would have handled it.
Yeah, he does. He handles it in a way that makes him, I suppose, in Asian philosophy, a deeply wise, sentient being. And he's only a 17-year-old, kid from the Bronx who didn't even finish high school yet. He has this emotional intelligence that he's got from his deep relationship with his mother, where he's able to deal with conflict in a way that most of us couldn't even imagine. He is the making. I mean, it's no coincidence, I think, that he's also a boxer. He's training to be a professional boxer because in the tradition of the samurai master, he embodies that stoicism.
So who did you hear this story from?
Metro New York, on the subway, Caroline.
Oh my God. Okay, so how are you getting people to talk to you and tell you these stories? Because as someone who's relatively introverted, if I'm on a subway somewhere, I'm very likely to be sort of the jerk who's reading a book and not like, hey, tell me your story. And when I do get a story, it's somebody like in grad school going on the BART from the East Bay into San Francisco. This woman spent 45 minutes telling me whether or not she should return a shirt she had bought because she just wasn't sure it was right for her. So I'm unlikely to turn that into a short story, although now I'm maybe thinking I should. How is this happening? I'm very curious about this.
That's a very good question. Well, first of all, being British in Kentucky and Texas and North Dakota, people don't really have a frame of reference, and therefore they don't really feel like I'm judging them. So people will
So they fling themselves at you.
In a way, I mean, I took a Greyhound bus across America, and I met gamblers, and I met drug dealers, and I met people on the run from the law. I met a lot of Native Americans, especially in the Oklahoma area, and the thing is, you get chatting to someone, and if they feel safe with you, and I'm the epitome of safety because I'm a father, I'm a dad, and dads have this sort of unspoken bond with each other too. So because you put someone else's life, and a husband too, but you put someone else's life before your own. So I think that makes you sort of trustworthy in a very sort of deep, ancient way, being a parent. So people just kind of chat to you if they don't feel judged. And also, I'm talking a lot now, and you probably don't believe this, but I don't actually, I like to listen to people more than talk. And so it's most of the people telling me these stories are in different countries, Ireland, English speaking, Ireland, Canada, and different parts of America where, that most people don't go, like, North Arkansas, or like, in the really deep in the woods in Mississippi or somewhere like that.
I think there are areas of places where people are naturally storytellers. I feel like Ireland is one of them. And I think the American South has that as well, where there's just these amazing stories, and then there's a culture around telling them to each other, that's something that's really valued.
Yeah, oh, absolutely. I mean, absolutely. I think the American media currently portrays Americans as being really polarized. But from my travels around the country, I don't see that at all. I see Americans as being actually quite enormous. They're usually risk takers, and they're extraordinarily curious as a group, and they're very hospitable if they don't feel like a threat to them. So I feel like I love living here. I really like Americans, and people have a political view, I suppose, based on their experience of life, and because some people in this country have such different experiences of life, what they feel is right might differ from, the reality of what's happening. Or so when I'm in Kentucky, and I'm very, very, very politically left, and but I always like to hear other people's opinions, and respecting people comes before. I wouldn't disrespect someone because they think differently, unless they're trying to kill me.
Well, that would, I think it's worth standing up for yourself in those moments.
Yeah, but we have to, there's, it's almost like we've been encouraged to define ourselves as extremists, in one way or another. We can't see the duplicity of, as you said, the doorman who's a doorman in a building on Fifth Avenue, but he's also a genius at jazz. And I think, it's. I wonder why we're monomaniacs in that way. John Berger, the philosopher, said that we're encouraged to define our interests as narrowly as possible because it's easier for companies to market things to us.
Oh, I totally believe that.
That's interesting. Yeah.
I think it's true. I mean, it's sort of like the terrifying sentence that begins with "I'm the kind of person who ... And I always fight that kind of categorization because I think that I don't really want to commit to a particular "I'm a kind of person who," because I know that it changes, and I think for most people it does. But I think that's something I enjoyed in this as well, is that nobody was hanging on to the "I'm the kind of person who" idea, and that there are always opportunities to do something different.
Yeah, that's very interesting. At any moment we have the power to change.
Yeah, I mean, that was something you mentioned, Buddhism, and I went once and I did a silent retreat for a week, and there was something fascinating that happened. Like, day one, total panic, not quiet at all, silent outwardly, not silent inwardly. Oh my God, how long am I to sit here? What am I doing? This is a terrible idea, blah, blah, blah. But by day 3, you kind of have this moment where you're breathing in between moments and then think, oh, you know what? These are all just stories I have been telling up to this point about what kind of person I am. And I really don't have to keep subscribing to them if I don't want to. And I always feel like reading fiction is a way to try on other stories mentally and say, well, how would it feel to do this one? I don't know if it was that way for you writing stories or if you have that experience at all.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, as a great tool for writing, of course, is reading, but also the ideas of I think ideas in Asian philosophy are extremely valuable to the creative writer because they open you up to new ideas and to new ways of exploring creativity, or at least for me. One of them, of course, I've just forgot what I was going to say. Does that ever happen?
All the time. All the time.
It might be age, too.
I don't know. I mean, I think we're almost exactly the same age, so I can't really speak from before or after that point.
Oh, I know what I was going to say. Well, these stories that we talk that are in this book I suppose I feel like they're our stories because, I mean, I've taken this energy of people connecting and I've presented it in a certain way that might make people recognize things about their own lives that they hadn't seen before and therefore feel more fulfillment or a sense of empowerment. But they're not my stories. I mean, all I did was I took water and I put it into a cup that maybe people haven't drunk out of before. But once it's drunk, the story is in you. I mean, it's your story. And so, the cup will change shape depending on the generation. Like one day, my work will seem completely antiquated, but the essence of the story, the characters, and their meetings with each other, that will still be going on in hundreds of years from now. And that's why, in the past, the stories of Silas Marner, George Eliot that I talked about, they're real. Those things are happening. Even Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff, and that's happening today. But obviously, people are in different clothes and they're driving cars. So.
Yeah, I think that's something that it always stays. I mean, I think about books that people read over and over and over again and why everybody still reads Pride and Prejudice and still reads Jane Eyre and still reads these books because I think people still have the emotional experience of what's inside of the story.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly it. So the question isn't, how do I write a short story? The question is, what story do I want to tell? Because there's so many in the world. When you go out and you talk to people, and you've got your own. If you've survived childhood, Virginia said you could write for the rest of your life. So,
True.
so it's not where do I find a story. It's like what kind of story do I want to write, and why this one. But you don't really have to question why, because I feel like there's a deeper instinct. The story chooses us rather than us choosing the story, and then you develop your own style. You'd shape the cup, as it were, by reading, and then with your own style, you choose. See what I mean? So it's sort of it's easy to overthink. It's much less complicated, I think, than we make it out to be.
I think so. I think you sort of know when you've hit on one that's, oh, this is a story I can really build a relationship with, that it's something we can get into a conversation about. So over 10 years, obviously, you didn't just have these few that ended up in the book. How did you decide which ones would end up in the collection? And are there more waiting in the wings that we'll get to read later?
Yeah, there are more. And actually, there are more. There are ghost stories, because I've been collecting those.
Oh, how exciting!
Yeah, and they're really chilling. I mean, a couple of them.
I can't wait.
There's nothing like there's nothing. The ghost stories I've heard from people, there's nothing like it I've ever seen explored on television. I mean, these are really, really unique, bizarre experiences. Ooh. But there's also something beautiful about them too. So I mean, I'd love to see a ghost mouse. I haven't heard of people seeing any ghost animals, and that makes me suspicious, because animals are living too. Or is it something about the way our brain is structured that allows us to? I don't know. It's remember that line from Shakespeare's Hamlet? There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than can be dreamt of in your philosophies.
Yes, absolutely. I think that's true. I mean, I guess maybe, of course, I want to think about it practically as well. Maybe the way we dismiss a ghost animal is we think it could be a real one, because it's possible that there's something scurrying around and you can't really ask it like, hey, could you come out here and show yourself?
Yeah, it's true. It's true. That's very interesting. I met an end-of-life psychiatrist a few weeks ago at a conference in Santa Barbara. And I said, how do people deal with death? Because she counsels people who are dying, geriatrics. And she said most of the time people handle death the way they handled life. If they panicked in life, they'll panic in death. If they were calm and sort of thoughtful, then they'll be kind and thoughtful in death. If they're aggressive, they'll be aggressive. So she says that's really how there's no big change when people are dying, or they learn they're dying. They handle it the way they handled everything. Isn't that interesting?
I think it is. I think we think that there are going to be, of course, I said earlier that I'm opposed to I'm the kind of person who kind of thinking. And at the same time, I think that we also have an unrealistic expectation of how much impact something is going to change. Like from now on, I will do this thing completely different. I think these sort of arbitrary distinctions of I always do things or I never do things don't seem to hold up forever. And that sort of generally leaning in a different direction often, at least for me, feels like a better way to try something new.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it? It's almost as though somebody once said to me, a scientist once said to me, "Ha, Simon, you think you have free will? Ha, 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 what a joke. You're just a tool for nature." And so I think, well, then nature must have a sense of humor, because
I think it absolutely must. Look at the platypus.
Yeah, and it wants to keep it. Yeah, that's right. That's funny. They're very cute. Nature wants to keep us in this state of sort of mild anxiety, or this state of sort of confusion. If it hadn't been for however early humans discovered fire, then we'd still be eating like steak tartare and sushi every day,
Which isn't a bad choice.
No, that's
nice
true.
To have options.
Yeah, that's true. But I think of the bacteria. I think of the parasites. Yes, Caroline, the parasites.
I know, it's horrifying. You're right.
But there was a time, anthropologists tell us, that humans didn't know that sexual intercourse led to conception, because it doesn't happen immediately. It doesn't happen overnight.
There's a delay. There's quite a significant delay.
College would be very different if dorms would have to be expanded. But Yeah, there's a delay. So, but at some point, humans figured out. Can you imagine that conversation? Terry was with Linda in the cave, and then now look, she's having, so they must
and
have.
that baby rather looks like Terry.
Yeah, but that's interesting you say that because what we're told is that men didn't realize they had an actual biological link to children.
That is fascinating.
Because they didn't know that sex led to conception. And scientists tell us that they probably figured it out about the same time that they figured out that every living thing, plant, contains the seeds of its own regeneration, just like we do.
It's so amazing to think of what it would be like not knowing that.
Yeah, and I feel like men are not as they don't hold each other accountable as for parenting as much as women do. Like, for instance, if a man says, I can't play squash this weekend, Terry, because I'm seeing my child, the friend will say, oh, that's nice, have a good time. But if a woman said, I can't play squash this weekend, Terry, because I'm seeing my daughter, the automatic response is, wow, what did you do wrong? Like, why do you only see, it's like women and men.
Yeah, why are you only seeing her at the weekend?
Yeah, so there's different standards. And I think that's evening out, though, thankfully. But I wonder if it goes back to that ancient past where men just didn't realize that they had any link to the child. Apart from a social one.
I don't know, but I think that's an amazing question. I think all of these things that you've brought up could possibly spin off into entire books. I mean, how do you...
that you and I would read, Caroline.
I know, we would read them. But this is the thing that I always think when people are thinking about things like this all of the time is, how do you decide, and I could talk to you all day, but I think I will wrap it on this question, which is, how do you decide which ones get to become stories and books when you're thinking about these ideas all the time? Because I think all of them could be, and all of them could be quite good.
Oh, thanks. That's a very interesting question. It's really just, I don't really think about it too much. It's the ones that sort of present themselves to me. I mean, I choose what to write as with the same freedom and power that I choose what to dream. Meaning that, like, stories I really don't choose. I mean, there's stories which beg me almost, not literally, but they compel me to write them. And I feel like there's different kinds of writing. Not all writing has to be the same. The variation is lovely, like with foods. For instance, so some stories would be good for escapism, for somebody like wishing to leave their life and disappear into a different world. But these stories are not like that. I do like escapist writing in some contexts, but these stories are intended as tools to go deeper into your own life. So they're hard. I mean, they're like health food. They don't taste good. They don't taste good sometimes. And of course, yes, they're gluten-free. But
Thank God.
So these stories are intended for the reader who wants to go deeper, definitely not the reader who wants to escape. And I didn't intend that when I wrote them, but I think that that's what, of looking at them as a whole, I've realized, well, that's what I prefer in life too. I don't mind a bit of discomfort if I learn something, because luxury is boring. And I think that a lot of people, after they've made a lot of money and they've lived in that kind of luxury, they realize, Jesus, I'm miserable. I just want a bike and a hat and a bottle of water, and I just want the freedom and simplicity. And so these stories are really about finding simplicity spiritually and emotionally.
Absolutely. Well, I hope that everybody loves them as much as I did.
Oh, thank you so much. Yes, let's hope.
That they snap it up with great gusto. But I so look forward to the ghost stories. You must come back and talk to us about the ghost stories when
thank you.
When they're out. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us.
Oh, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you, Caroline.
Thank you for listening to the Secret Library podcast. The show is produced by me, Caroline Donahue, and Frederick Barry McWilliams Jr., my tireless audio engineer. To get show notes for this episode and all other episodes, please visit secretlibrarypodcast.com. To get updates, literary love, and notification when new episodes are posted, sign up there for Footnotes, my newsletter. And to learn about life coaching with me to work on building your writing life, visit carolinedonahue.com. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. Gold stars to everybody who leaves a rating and review on iTunes. We're so grateful. Until next time, happy reading.